My next guest is going to try and fill me in on something that this is my favorite story of the day. There's not a whole lot in the news that's making me laugh today, but I saw, did the Supreme Court just say President Trump can deport people to countries they're not even from? Susham M's back on, immigration expert. Welcome back to the James show, Susham. Do I have that right, or am I misreading these articles?
Hey, thanks for having me back on the James show. I appreciate you. No, you read it right, but it's a little bit more narrow than that. So the Supreme Court did issue a decision recently, but it was just on the injunction part. So not on the merits of whether individuals could be deported to a third country, but just while the case is being argued, like while it's being litigated, that the judge shouldn't hold the deportations. And it's also narrowed in the Supreme Court case. It dealt with somebody that had a removal order and had something called withholding of removal, where they would show it's more likely than not that they would be tortured in their home country. Like they already won that trial. And then the government changed the actual place of removal to a third country. And what the attorneys argued for the individual in deportation was, hey, we should get a notice and an ability just to even argue, right, that whether I could be tortured in a third country, like Libya, for example. And that's what the judges put on hold, those deportations, and the Supreme Court lifted that hold while the rest of the case is still being argued. So not on the merits, but just on the hold of not deporting individuals to a third country when they have a removal order.
So how does that work? Do we have like a big wheel of fortune and we just spin it, and whatever country it lands on, that's where they go? You can say no. You can.
Interestingly enough, I mean, I don't know how it works. Maybe it will be like that, but I think it's agreements that probably the U.S. is making with these countries, and they're not great countries. They're to be deported to, like Libya and Sudan were some of them. And then what's really horrifying about this is the individual who had won, one of the individuals who was deported to this third country, the individual who won that case is from Guatemala. They proved to a judge he would be more likely than not tortured if he's returned to Guatemala. So I think they sent him to Libya, and then Libya sent him back to Guatemala, where he would be tortured.
Okay.
So this is really, really horrifying stuff here.
Well, one, I guess, area where this makes just logical sense to me is and we're talking with Susham M, an immigration expert here, is that these people who are claiming asylum, but they don't come from an adjacent country, and the rules say if you're claiming asylum, you have to go to the first safe country and make your application there. And so for the people who are from, I don't know, like Guatemala or somewhere further away, and they're trying to get asylum here, it would make sense to say, no, you got to go back to Mexico or, the first safe country you went through and apply there. So in my mind, the guy's not a citizen of Mexico. He doesn't belong here either, but he's being sent to a third country that he's not from. And I think it's really hard to argue against that, but that's not what it's based on.
Exactly right. Well, two things. One, it's not what it's based on. I mean, these are countries they have no affiliation with, that are horrible places to be detained. I think everybody would agree, like Sudan, Libya, El Salvador are some brutal prisons. But number two, the country issue of applying for asylum with an adjacent country, it's not as simple as that. There is something called safe third country. So for example, if somebody entered Canada first, they had to apply in Canada, like they cannot apply in the US, but they're very limited, like the safe third country. And then there's another rule called firm resettlement. So if you have like the equivalent of permanent residency in another country, and you can be safely relocated there, you can't get asylum in the U.S. But those are old rules. So as of like now, like even if you went into a different country first, you can still apply for asylum if you got into the U.S. But then there's more complicated rules than that, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, I do like how this could work out because, you know, if you really wanted to mess with someone, send them to a country they don't want to go to. You know, like who is ultimately making the decisions? Like, who said Libya is where the Guatemalan needs to go? Do we know that level of detail?
I don't know that level of detail, but I can tell you the countries that they're choosing. You know, I think they're using it as a deterrent, as a fearful deterrent that, hey, you know, you could be deported to one of these places. And it's really scary because not only what humanitarian, like what could happen to like the individual I told you about earlier, that's more likely than not going to be tortured. I mean, after a full trial, the judges found is more likely not going to be tortured in Guatemala, and those third countries are sending them back to the original country. But that's one huge humanitarian problem. But the other is if we just take like a procedural look at it, it kind of nullifies in a lot of ways the entire process, like due process, asylum, refugee law, Convention Against Torture, the right to have your hearing heard, those sorts of things. If they can just at the last minute change the country, because remember when the individual applied and had a trial, that they'd be more likely than not tortured in Guatemala.
Right.
Government attorneys, as part of the Department of Homeland Security, issued that as the place to deport them when the judge agreed. So, you know, it's like going backwards in time with no hearing, without any notice, without any trial. And it's going to be really hard. I mean, there are arguments that lawyers can try to get in front of a federal judge to put on hold, but that's going to be really hard because the government said, hey, we could deport somebody within 15 minutes. I mean, it'd be next to impossible to put together a good legal argument in front of a federal judge in less than 15 minutes.
All right. Well, good chat. I appreciate you explaining this to us. This is immigration attorney Susham Modi. You can find his website, themodilawfirm.com, MODI. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you for having me.